Well, from an obscure psalm last time, Psalm 22, with a very familiar verse, verse 1, to now a very well known psalm, Psalm number 23. Arguably the most well beloved of all the Psalms, one that's quoted probably most often. In fact, the Gideons, the people who place the Bibles in hotels and hospitals and doctors' offices and such, often report that when they go to replace these Bibles, they replace ones that were stolen, but periodically they go back and replace ones that are worn out and well used. They'll report that very often the section of the Bible that is most used, the section that's wore out, it's the dirtiest, it's the most tattered, is the book of Psalms, probably because it's in the middle of the Bible. So even a person who doesn't know the Bible well, if they're in a hotel room and bored, might open the Bible to the middle and find the book of Psalms. But they say it's particularly Psalm number 23 that has been read the most. Even here in South Carolina, one of the things you notice if you've been to very many funerals at all is seemingly every funeral has some citation from Psalm 23. I can't think of one that I've been to or led here since I've lived here for 12 and a half years that didn't include Psalm 23 somewhere in the funeral service. And so it's a well-known psalm, but with all kinds of imagery that perhaps we sometimes miss some of the nuance of David's writing. So let's go ahead and read Psalm 23, and then let's start thinking through what it is David has to say to us today. See if I can do this without citing the King James. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So there you have it. Most of it you probably already knew. You've heard, you've recited, you've read repeatedly. But some of the imagery in it is, in one sense, very familiar, and maybe in another sense, not familiar at all. The imagery, first of all, that God, the Lord here, Yahweh, is my shepherd. The Bible in multiple places refers to God in shepherd-like language, where he's leading his people, he's providing for his people, he's guiding them by fire or smoke through the wilderness. But there's also language of promise that one day, for example, Ezekiel chapter 34, God promises that after all the bad shepherds have abused God's people, the kings, the priests, their various leaders have taken advantage of them, one day God himself will come and shepherd his people. And so this idea of God as the one who leads us and guides us is a common thought throughout Scripture. The Lord is my shepherd. And because of that, David writes, I shall not want. And now he begins a section where he describes himself and us, God's people, in the language of sheep. Now, we've heard jokes about sheep. They're dirty and not real bright. The language here is they're dependent, that they need the shepherd. And so because God is our shepherd, we shall not want. He makes us to lie down in green pastures. He takes us to a safe place. He takes us to a place where it's comfortable, a place where there's enough food that we can eat to our fill. Makes us to lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside still water. Sheep are notoriously skittish, afraid of noises and sounds. And so water that rumbles and makes lots of noise, sheep are less likely to drink from. It's liable to keep them anxious and on guard. And so he leads us beside still waters. And by doing so, it says he restores my soul. It brings refreshing when God calms us, when God settles us in, when God provides for us, restores our souls. It says that he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The shepherd's job is not to drive the sheep through the valley. The shepherd's job is to lead the sheep where he would have them to go. The sheep know his voice, we're told, and they follow him. And so he leads them not on just any path, but on the path of righteousness. Narrow is the path that leads to righteousness. Not the broad way, but the narrow way. He leads us to the one we need to be on if we'll just follow him. And he does so, it says there in verse 3, for his name's sake. He doesn't do it just for our sake. We often focus on our benefit in the relationship, but God is doing it for his name's sake. And then, of course, verse 4, probably the most well-known of all the verses in the psalm, one that's often cited by soldiers getting ready to go into combat, people who are, watching on a deathbed, waiting for a family member, a beloved person to pass away. Again, hard not to cite it in the King James, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So the sheep metaphor continues. Even when God leads us into what is seemingly a dangerous place, a place that was fraught with toil or danger and tribulation, even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death. I've heard people try to explain that there was a valley between Jerusalem and Jericho that was a scary place and that you're likely to get mugged or robbed there. They'll often say that that's the same story, place that Jesus talks about in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Irrelevant at this point, right? We don't know when David wrote this psalm, but he may not have even conquered Jerusalem yet. David, however, knew what it was like to live in the wilderness as he fled from Saul multiple times out into the wilderness, or even when he fled from Absalom, his own son, during the rebellion. Either way, he knows that even though he's walking in that valley of the shadow of death, death is nearby. God has led him there. Remember, he's already told us in verse 3, God is leading us, so we don't go there by accident. God is leading us. He says, I won't fear. I'll fear no evil. Why? Because for you are with me. God is with us in this. He's led us there, and he'll lead us through it. And his rod and his staff, one meant to protect the sheep, the other meant to guide the sheep. The presence of both comfort, whether it's God's discipline or God's correction, God's guidance, meant for our comfort. Now, of course, we could extrapolate further out of that the imagery here is that Christ, because he is the good shepherd, he has been through death. He knows the way through the valley. He leads us through as well, and it ought to bring us great comfort. Then in verse 5, the metaphor shifts. Having passed through death, literally, there's no promise in verse 4 that you're going to come out of death, the valley, without dying. He's leading you into the valley. That's the majesty, the mystery, if you will, of him being comforted rather than fearful. He comes through that valley of shadow of death. He dies there, and he comes out the other side. And then the metaphor shifts. We're no longer sheep. Now we're treated as honored guests. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now the language is the victory feast, the banquet, the wedding feast of the Lamb, if you think in the New Testament. Or think of Joseph throwing a feast for his brothers when they came to Egypt and they finally begin to realize who he is, and he seats them around a table and he feeds them from his own table. They're treated as honored guests. God has prepared a table in his house. Remember, Jesus said he's going to God's house to prepare a place for us. He's prepared a table for me in the presence of my enemies. The enemy, the defeated, will watch God's victorious people celebrate. You anoint my head with oil. You're a celebrated, honored guest. And the cup overflows. Love the imagery of the cup overflowing. It's like going to a good restaurant where you take a sip out of your cup and you put it down on the table, and before you turn around, they've filled it again for you. Except here, the waiter, the host, is the one who's filling it, and he never runs out. The cup overflows, and it flows, and it flows. And then perhaps maybe even the most majestic of all thoughts in the psalm, verse 6. Surely, most definitely, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. In light of the fact that God is his shepherd, in light of the fact that God is going to lead us through the valley of the shadow of death, that God is going to guide us and protect us, that God has an honored place for us at his table, surely, if all that's true, goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Not just in the end, but my entire existence. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I'll dwell in the presence of God, in his house, never to be separated again. David understood. We don't know how much he understood about the afterlife. The ideas of the afterlife and what happens when we die are slowly developing in the thoughts of the writers of the Old Testament. And so it's not always a complete theology of death. But here, David clearly understands. He's going to face death. He's going to die. He's going to come out the other side, and he's going to dwell in the presence of God forever. Those words ought to comfort us. Those words ought to encourage us in whatever dark night of the soul we might be going through. And those words ought to bring us great consolation and joy, knowing that as Christ promised in John 10, he is the good shepherd. He's been through the valley. He's come out the other side. And as he promised the disciples in the upper room, I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. One day I'll come back and get you, that where I am, there you might be also. If God is your shepherd, you shall not want, and all that you need will be yours forever. Rejoice, celebrate in God's goodness, and give him the glory for it.